What's up, you guys? Erika Kirk just confirmed their agenda at the TPUSA event. This is what they killed Charlie for.
She just confirmed their agenda.
We're going to ensure that President Trump has Congress for all 4 years.
Wait.
We are going to get my husband's friend, JD Vance, elected for 48 in the most resounding way possible.
Some people may think there's no way he's not Trump. But the thing is, when you have Turning Point USA and Erika Kirk backing you up, especially after she shared the stats of how many Club America and Turning Point USA chapters are opening up within our high schools and colleges. They have over 1 million student body members. Listen to her share the stats.
Total number of students involved. This is involved within Turning Point USA. 1 million plus students involved in Turning Point USA. Current chapter numbers as of December 18th, 2025. 3,082 Club America chapters. 1,432 college chapters. So that leaves 4,514 total chapters as of today. And we are starting 50 chapters per day at Turning Point USA. It's amazing.
This is terrifying. They are growing rapidly. This is the reason why she is campaigning already. She's out touring and all of these events and interviews. That's their agenda. And we need to counter that somehow.
She is absolutely right, and those people wouldn't be clapping if they knew what I knew. Check it out. This is what JD Vance is going for. We got 7 years.
He grows up in a dying steel town in the Midwest. He deals with chaos, danger, and addiction at home. He has no support system. For him, even making it out alive was a dream. But then, against all odds, he gets out. First, JD Vance does a tour of duty with the Marines. Then he graduates top of his class at Ohio State. Then he just keeps magically rising higher and higher through Yale Law School, into venture capital. Then he drops a best-selling book.
Well, our guest today grew up poor in the midst of the dysfunctional culture of Appalachia. J.D. Vance and his hillbilly elegy.
Then he's elected into the Senate.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans?
And then finally, he becomes the Vice President of America.
So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. Vice President.
He does it all by the age of just 41. It's impressive, almost too much so. In the end, it became so impressive that it was impossible to ignore. How exactly does a guy with almost no political resume, who spends years publicly trashing the movement he ends up joining,
Trump is a really bad candidate, and frankly, I think a really bad person.
suddenly have an ocean of money, media support, and institutional backing the second they decide he wants power?
I formally declare President Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance as the Republican nominees for President and Vice President of the United States.
Well, here's the problem. The rise of JD Vance wasn't really sudden at all, because in reality, he's only one small piece of a much larger, more complicated puzzle that many people believe is intended to slowly destroy our future in the name of money, power, and capital. Because you can't overthrow a country like the US with tanks and guns.
There's nobody can beat us. No, we have the strongest military in the world by far.
You do it with narratives, with stories. You do it by inviting everyone to believe in their own downfall while making yourself look like the savior.
Whether they were eating geese or dogs, is that really what we're going to hang our hat on?
And so this is the story of J.D. Vance. Or perhaps, more importantly, it's the story of the money, the ideology, and the people that made his perfectly calculated hypocrisy possible in the first place.
We're just getting started. Please like, subscribe to the channel, and share with a friend. Let's get back into it.
Whose parents were highly recognized academics in their fields. She helped him find his social footing in a world that was foreign to him. And within a couple of years, they were engaged. Perhaps most important of all, though, was one specific lecture that J.D. Vance attended in his first year, hosted by Peter Thiel, who who 10 years earlier had co-founded PayPal and turned it into one of the biggest online companies of the early 2000s. After selling PayPal for billions, he had gone on to become a hugely influential investor that many in tech looked up to as a philosopher of science and progress. He had come to Yale to discuss his idea that, in fact, technology and progress were suffering from stagnation, and that both Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and elite law students were all focused on the wrong things. That everyone was looking for high-paying corporate jobs, trying to build new social media apps, whatever it was. The point was that those were both not truly innovative, but they were also not really meaningful to the people doing them either. Basically, Thiel's speech was, hey, go look for something that genuinely matters and makes you feel fulfilled, because in reality, they're probably the same thing, and you're also probably not getting either of those from your average law firm job. And that changed JD Vance's life. A few years later, he would write, "Peter's talk remains the most significant moment of my time at Yale. He articulated a feeling that until then had remained unformed, that I was obsessed with achievement not as an end to something meaningful, but to win a social competition. I looked to the future and realized that I had been running a desperate race where the first prize was a job I hated. And so ultimately..."
Here's where we get to the real story and who's backing JD Vance.
Venture capital, JD Vance hops off the corporate treadmill and turns his life story into a book. Hillbilly Elegy, released in the summer of 2016, was part memoir and part social commentary. It was a story about the socioeconomic problems of his hometown, how they affected the trajectory of his life, his family's life, the life of the people he grew up around, and how that played into a lot of the problems America was facing at the time. And it made him a celebrity overnight.
Well, I'm joined live from San Francisco by the author J.D. Vance. His best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, depicts what it's like to grow up white and poor in America, and it's taken the country by storm. J.D. Vance, drug problems, joblessness,
JD's book
poverty.
came at a moment when his personal story was exactly what America wanted to hear. Sure, it was just a memoir about a kid from a broke working-class town who later reached elite circles, but more than that, it was bleeding-edge commentary. It was a claim about what went wrong back home, and what, supposedly, could be done about it. And it landed at the perfect moment.
What would it feel like to wake up on your terms, work from anywhere, and actually enjoy what you do while helping others? My name is
I am officially running for President of the United States.
The summer of 2016 wasn't calm or normal. It was a full-blown media panic over Donald Trump's presidential run. Trump was bulldozing a field of 16 Republican candidates.
Maybe it works for Hillary Clinton. It doesn't work for anybody on this stage.
I was a businessman. I got along with Clinton. I got along with everybody.
Yeah, but the simple fact is...
Excuse me. 1 second.
No.
I didn't want to...
The simple fact is, Donald, you cannot take...
More energy tonight. I like that.
Pulling massive crowds and dominating cable news, and yet almost nobody in the professional political world really understood why.
Right. I mean, I think he has some sort of connection with people that they feel is missing with the other candidates.
His mix of right-wing populism, hardline conservatism, and reality TV-style aggression was rejected wholeheartedly by people inside the status quo. People who built their whole careers on the old consensus were suddenly forced to admit that they had no idea why a guy that they saw as a joke was connecting so deeply with millions of voters.
Don't vote for him because he's tough. He's a baby with even smaller fingers.
But it just so happened that most of those millions seemed to be the exact kind of people that JD Vance grew up around for his whole life. As the truth became obvious, it was an uncomfortable one. It was that the people who loved Trump so much were, as Hillary Clinton famously said, a basket of deplorables. And that the only reason Donald Trump was so beloved, so popular, was because he was speaking directly to what they were feeling for the first time. JD Vance could explain why people loved Trump, because the silent majority of working-class towns were falling apart, because normal, average people felt betrayed by the system, and because Trump represented a dissatisfaction with the whole situation. Vance understood why people loved Trump, because they hated everyone else. But at the same time, JD Vance could explain exactly why it would never work. He would call Trump America's Hitler, a dictator, a liar.
Trump is a really bad candidate, and frankly, I think a really bad person.
You name it. It was no secret how JD Vance felt about Trump's politics. He saw him as a dark reflection of all of the country's worst problems.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. Look, we told you so. To all these white working class voters, we told you so. We told you that Trump was going to be a terrible candidate. We told you that you were an idiot if you voted for him. The problem is, if you take that attitude as sort of gloating over Trump's defeat, then you're playing into the very thing that gave rise to Trump in the first place, which is a feeling that the elites think that they're smarter than you and just think you're a bunch of idiots.
And maybe J.D. Vance even was a conservative, but he was a principled, educated one. He recognized that America had real problems that needed to be fixed with conservatism. But he also made it clear that the MAGA conservative movement was never going to be the correct solution.
I think it's totally fair to say that the policy elites of the Democratic Party haven't been totally concerned about the white working class, but at the same time, fundamentally what's going on and what Donald Trump has done is change the focus of the white working class from a sort of engaged and constructive politics to a politics of pointing the finger.
Cable shows start bringing Vance on as the thoughtful hillbilly whisperer, the Yale-educated Marine who could sit in a studio and calmly explain why the forgotten white working class is lining up behind a guy that the rest of the system considers to be a clown. At one point, he even wrote an article in the New York Times called Barack Obama and Me, where he talks about looking up to Barack Obama as a personal role model for most of his adult life. He later said, "Eventually, I achieved something roughly similar to the president's early personal accomplishments. Law degree, a strong professional career, and a modicum of fame as a writer. There were many personal heroes in my life, aunts and uncles, sisters, a father who re-entered my life at the right time. But I benefited too from the example of a man whose public life showed that we need not to be defeated by the domestic hardships of youth." He wrote, "It is one of the great failures of the Republican Party that they were too often unable to disconnect legitimate political disagreements from the fact that the president himself is an admirable man." I think you guys get the picture. I don't know how else I could make it clear whose side J.D. Vance was on 10 years ago. I mean, for years, he was a CNN correspondent. He was writing op-eds. He was the guy when this discussion came up. In 2017, he even sells the film rights for Hillbilly Elegy, with a film adaptation coming in 2020 that ended up receiving 2 Academy Award nominations. And so J.D. Vance had made it all the way to the top of the liberal prestige pyramid. He's a best-selling New York Times author. He has a movie about his life. He was on every news network you could think of all the time, just commenting on the state of politics, giving his his measured takes on the state of the country. And so in 2018, J.D. Vance and his family buy a $1.5 million mansion in a wealthy neighborhood of Cincinnati. This kid who grew up with no money, always worrying about how to make it from day to day, he now had more than enough to last a lifetime. But he moved back home for a reason. He later said, "I believe that the way our society is currently structured, with a lot of people who are very successful and well-educated, siloing themselves off in these coastal enclaves, being bad for the country and bad for those people." Like with everything else he did at the time, he wrote an article covering his thoughts. He said, "The unbelievable wealth and the way that it shields people from the problems of the real world, it's very easy to ignore the fact that there are a lot of people who are struggling." In his words, he was moving back to focus on what he really truly cared about, making his home a better place. More than that, though, it did obviously seem like the perfect setup for launching a career in politics. J.D. Vance was independently wealthy, he had moved back to his home state, and he had a coherent platform and reputation to run on. But in reality, the version of J.D. Vance who arrived back in Ohio would overnight become an almost completely, fundamentally different person than he had ever been before. And sure enough, just a couple of years later, in April of 2022, J.D. Vance runs an advertisement titled, "Are You a Racist?" And in it, he says,
"Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans?"
He launches into an ad supporting Trump's border wall, talking about Mexicans bringing fentanyl across the border, and blah, blah, blah. It was official. J.D. Vance was running for Senate, but he was doing it as Trump's guy. Vance's campaign for Senate was out and out MAGA. He rails against Joe Biden's immigration policies. He talks about getting rid of legal immigration. He goes on and on about a zero-tolerance abortion policy. He advocates for firing bureaucrats and replacing them with Trump loyalists. My point is that when J.D. Vance was running for Senate, he said just about anything he possibly could to win the MAGA vote. He even goes on television apologizing outright for everything he's ever said in the past. He's on Fox News saying, "I regret being wrong. I think Trump was a great president. I'm sorry for what I said."
Well, first of all, Margaret, because I've always been open. And sometimes, of course, I've disagreed with the president, but I've also been extremely open about the fact that I was wrong about Donald Trump. I was wrong, first of all, because I believed some of the media stories that turned out to be dishonest fabrications of his record. But most importantly, Donald Trump delivered for the American people.
At rallies, he says, "The simple fact is, he's the best president of my lifetime, and he revealed the corruption in this country like no one else." Although ultimately, beyond the TV appearances and podcast interviews, what Vance needed above everything else was Donald Trump's forgiveness. But then, just a few months after the election, Trump announces that he had picked the Ohio candidate he wanted to endorse, and it was J.D. Vance. In November, Vance wins by a thin margin, defeating Democrat Tim Ryan to become the junior senator from Ohio at the age of 38, the youngest person to be elected to that office in over 100 years. And he did it on the MAGA platform he had spent the last 6 or 7 years railing against in public. But then he doesn't stop there. Because before his first term in the Senate's over, less than 2 years into Vance's career as a politician, Trump picks him as his running mate on the campaign to get back into the presidency. And so at the age of 40 years and 100 days, J.D. Vance becomes the second youngest vice president to ever enter office. And he does it without ever really having had a career as a politician in the first place. But that's actually kind of crazy. He has this inspiring rags to riches story, but when you actually look at his resume, the rise to power is overly sudden. His political record, let's just call it thin, all right? Let's put it nicely and say his political record is skinny. This is a guy who just becomes the vice president without really ever having had a career in politics to begin with. He just walks into the White House with no experience. In fact, he has negative experience. Right before JD Vance runs for Senate, he was railing against the political movement that he suddenly just gets picked to lead a couple years later. But I don't really think it's that simple, okay? You can call JD Vance a grifter or a liar, a typical politician, but I don't think that's what we're working with here. There are grifters all over politics. I mean, 8 years ago, the entire Republican Party hated Donald Trump. Of course, though, they all fall in line once they realize that's the way the party's going. But again, I just don't think that's what's going on here. According to JD Vance, when he's on TV doing his apology tour, he realized that Donald Trump had been right all along and that he was wrong. He had been misled by the media, and actually, sure, why not? Why not refine your beliefs over time? Why not change your mind based on truth and facts and evidence? Like I said, though, if this were just the story of one more guy selling out for Trump's approval, the video would be over. We could all roll our eyes and just chalk it up to typical politician bullshit, and the story ends there. We all move on with our lives in a state of vague disappointment. But that doesn't actually explain what happened. That doesn't explain how a guy with no political record, who spends years calling Donald Trump a disaster, suddenly has an ocean of money, media, and institutional support snap into place the second he decides he wants to take power. That kind of support doesn't appear out of thin air, especially not for a random freshman senator who used to be on the other side. That's the sort of support that comes when people with a lot of money and a very specific agenda have been quietly investing in you for years. So if we really want to understand how JD Vance ends up just a heartbeat away from the presidency, it's not about him being a hypocrite or selling out or whatever. In reality, we have to look all the way back to the beginning and uncover a much more complicated truth about the people who have already been pushing him since before the outside world knew JD Vance at all. Because years before the MAGA movement even existed to begin with, a system was being put in place to make sure that JD Vance would eventually end up exactly where he now stands today. Let's start with a story that JD Vance shows up at Yale Law School as a confused hillbilly who didn't understand sparkling water. Well, it's just not true. That's what he writes in his book, that's what he says to the media over and over and over, but it is not the true story. It starts with David Frum. In the early 2000s, Frum worked for years as a speechwriter in George W. Bush's White House. He's the one who came up with the famous Axis of Evil quote during the Iraq War. After that, he works at various think tanks and writes about politics for a number of magazines and papers, and then, in 2009, he founds a new political blog all his own called the Frum Forum, with the aim of creating an online community featuring many different voices that appeals to younger readers who are often repelled by mainstream conservatism. On there, he pays a bunch of young conservative readers to submit articles. And one person out of the many who would write articles for Frum Forum around 2010 to 2011 was a 25-year-old JD Vance, who was at the time studying at Ohio State after getting out of the Marines. Now, why is that? Well, back in the day, David Frum was starting a movement. He later writes, "I tried to imagine a reformed Republican Party, more economically inclusive, more modern, more environmentally aware. The project proved unsuccessful, to put it mildly. But while that project did still have juice, he quickly became a mentor for Vance. He had him as a guest at his home in D.C. for dinner parties. He helped him outline and plan a book he wanted to write about his childhood in Ohio. In one article he wrote about his relationship with Vance a couple of years ago, he writes out what the plan was all along. Before the 2016 election, J.D. Vance's future political path looked straightforward. He would await the expected Trump defeat, then emerge as a next-generation Republican savior. A candidate who could speak from his origins in Appalachia to the suburbs of Columbus, all while preserving his connections to his donors in Silicon Valley. And so ultimately, even before J.D. Vance gets to Yale, it's already being planned by elite conservative figures that he's on the track to becoming a political leader. At the same time as he says he couldn't use a serving fork when he got to New Haven, he was, in reality, having dinner at George W. Bush's speechwriter's house. Funny enough, one of the main reasons that David Frum seems to hate J.D. Vance now and continues to write articles about him to this day is because Frum is a massive Zionist, and Vance seems to have flirted a little too much with critics of Israel. Well, anyway. Too, he writes, "His abilities I never underestimated. What he was willing to do for political advancement, I did." The anti-populist conservative Vance persona of 2010 to 2017 was well designed to please the individuals and constituencies that held power over his future at that time. The angry white male persona of 2017 onward was as perfectly aimed at the Thiel-Trump-Tucker nexus as the earlier iteration had been to the Aspen-Atlantic one. While David Frum may have given J.D. Vance his start in political blogging, and he may even have been grooming him to be a political superpower later on, and his recommendation may even be the reason why J.D. Vance got into Yale to begin with J.D. Vance being a student at Ohio State and David Frum being a high-level political speechwriter who went to Yale, he wasn't the only person who would realize that J.D. Vance's Ohio origin story was the ultimate political superpower, because he's definitely not the reason why J.D. Vance ends up in the White House. Because, in fact, there was also a much bigger fish behind Vance's shoulder for a long time. So here's what happened. In 2011, J.D. Vance goes to billionaire entrepreneur Peter Thiel's guest lecture at Yale, and it makes him realize there's more to life than law school. Blah, 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 we know the story, okay? He later says that he loved the lecture so much that he emails Thiel after, who sets up a meeting, and then they begin this long-running mentor-mentee friendship. And so here's the part that's really crazy. Hillbilly Elegy was never just a memoir that launched J.D. Vance's public career. It was always meant to make him a politician. From the start, it was a plan by Peter Thiel to help Vance cultivate influence and build up towards power, because Peter Thiel would pull every lever he had available to make this book possible. Because as we saw, The idea wasn't originally to make JD Vance the MAGA guy. Originally, he was supposed to be the anti-Trump, the guy who comes after Hillary and explains to every little unwashed, blue-collar, undesirable why Trump was bad. Because most people genuinely thought that in 2015, Trump was a freak event, a bubble that would burst, and that there was no way that he would build a real movement and actually lose to Hillary Clinton. Even on the morning of the election day that year, the odds were like 9-1 that Trump was not going to be the president. That's what everyone believed. And so the reception to Hillbilly Elegy was a setup. It was meant to make JD Vance look like this principled anti-Trump conservative who could step in and pick up the pieces after the Trump movement burns out. He was David Frum and Peter Thiel and everyone else's plan to gain power after Trump disappears. And Peter Thiel pays for all of this to happen. Step 1 worked really well. JD Vance becomes this little CNN celebrity and his book is everywhere. But then Trump wins. The strategy collapses. It becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that the principled anti-Trump conservative has no future in politics. The world moves on. And JD Vance ends up trapped in the worst position he could possibly be in, having built a brand on bashing Trump. Like, you're trying to set up for a career in politics, and you accidentally end up criticizing the guy who becomes God Emperor of the universe. Without Trump, you would have no more donors, no future, and no movement. Because when JD Vance moves back to Cincinnati in 2018, he immediately founds 3 new organizations, and Peter Thiel gets involved with all of them. In 2019, JD Vance opens a company called Rockbridge that he describes as a political venture capital firm, bringing investors together to fund projects that disrupt the status quo. In plain terms, it's a company with the goal of funding, shaping, and controlling the conservative ecosystem in America. It's not a political action committee, it's not a nonprofit. They are literally going to fund conservative narratives online. Their investors were tech billionaires like Peter Thiel, the Winklevoss twins, Rebecca Mercer, and more, with membership to the group costing up to $1 million per person, with over 200 members as of 2025. Their purpose was pretty clear. They weren't building a fund to give JD Vance a Senate candidacy, they were creating a system that could control and influence an entire generation of conservatism. In 2019, he also formed Narya Capital in Cincinnati, a venture capital firm of his own that he used to raise over $93 million primarily from Peter Thiel and his funds, that then gets invested in a variety of companies, one of which was Rumble, the video platform that over time has become popular with conservative content creators. They've also invested in the Tucker Carlson network, among others. Basically, JD Vance, before running for Senate and after getting back to Ohio, spent a bunch of money investing in taking control of the conservative online entertainment ecosystem. Then, when he announces that he's going to run for Senate in 2021, Peter Thiel gives JD Vance $15 million, the largest amount of money ever given to a single Senate candidate, through a super PAC running ads online and on TV for JD Vance's campaign.
I feel like we've all been there. You go to the doctor, you get your blood drawn, and then a week later you hear, yep, everything looks good. Drink a little.
JD Vance is sending a message. The elites plunder this country and then blame us for it in the process. And when those Americans dare to complain about the conditions of their own country, they dare to complain about the southern border or about jobs getting shipped overseas, what do they get called? They get called racist. They get called idiots. They need somebody who's willing to speak for them, who's willing to fight for them.
We really, I think, understand what's gone wrong with the country.
Protect Ohio Values is responsible for the content of this advertising.
The story goes that Peter Thiel even then goes on to organize a meetup between Trump, someone he's donated millions of dollars to, and JD Vance, whose career he created, at Mar-a-Lago to introduce JD Vance as a newfound MAGA loyalist and earn the endorsement that his Senate campaign would have been dead without. And so what we're looking at is proof that not only is the entire origin story of JD Vance's career manufactured, but that the entire trajectory of his adult life has been paid for and planned by someone else, a tech billionaire. Without Peter Thiel, JD Vance may never have made it past Sidley Austin. He would probably still be sitting in a boardroom right now, taking meetings for mergers and acquisitions in downtown Chicago, collecting a modest $550,000 salary, living in a restored single-family home on the north side, raising his kids. And the important part is that Peter Thiel, over the course of 10 years, pushed JD Vance's life in a totally different direction. But why? I mean, Peter Thiel isn't even one of the big tech billionaires. By all accounts, he's a minor player in the world of money and influence. He doesn't own his own social media platform. He's not worth $200, $100, or even $50 billion. He doesn't own any private islands. I mean, his companies aren't even worth a $1 trillion market cap yet. What I'm saying is, he's no Larry Ellison or Elon Musk, all right? But what Peter Thiel does have is a plan for the future of America. A plan that he's been building for over 20 years. And that plan is totally rooted in the fact that Peter Thiel hates Americans. Here's the rundown. Look, if you want to catch the full story, I have an hour-and-a-half long biography of Peter Thiel. I'll link it below. But essentially, in the late 90s, Peter Thiel co-founds PayPal, and it becomes one of the only companies to emerge on top of the dot-com bubble after it sells to eBay for $2 billion in 2001. But Peter Thiel doesn't go start more companies and make himself a celebrity entrepreneur or whatever, because he himself was never a tech bro. Peter Thiel had gotten degrees in philosophy and politics. He went to law school. His whole thing was that he was a libertarian futurist. He was big on low taxes, free speech, capitalism, small government, and most importantly, technology. But anyway, after PayPal blows up and he sells it and he has enough money to do whatever he wants, Peter Thiel goes and he started investing in tech companies whose ideas match his in one way or another. He invests in Uber, Airbnb, SpaceX. Basically, he helps build these companies that were taking away services that were usually part of a bigger legacy industry or even the government and putting it in the hands of less regulated tech companies. His whole thing was that he wanted to foster global technological progress through the internet and away from government regulation. Over time, this makes him even richer and even more famous as the world of tech starts to see him as a philosophical investor. But along the way, Peter Thiel's ideas start to change. Stuff like 9/11, the Great Recession in 2008. He slowly begins to convince himself that the American system is failing, that tech and progress is stagnating, and that the government is a messy, broken system that will never get out of his way so that he can move the world forward. And the problem, in his mind, ultimately became democracy. But I must confess that over the last 2 decades, I have changed radically on the question of how to achieve these goals. Most importantly, I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. And so Peter Thiel arrives at the conclusion that democracy is never going to work. Mostly because people like him are going to be held back by welfare recipients or whoever who are more concerned with voting to improve their pathetic immediate surroundings versus putting efforts towards the greater good of the human race, which of course he thinks he could achieve if only there were less taxes and rules on capitalism. Peter Thiel wasn't alone either. In the late 2000s, there are guys like Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land who start to blur the line between tech and philosophy with the idea that liberal democracy has totally failed and needs to be replaced with a neo-feudal corporate monarchy, with countries run by national CEOs with unlimited power and no accountability to voters. By 2021, JD Vance starts quoting him openly. On a podcast that year, he repeats Yarvin's rage plan verbatim: fire government workers, replace them with Trump loyalists, and turn America into a country with no political accountability, a corporate takeover style approach to the government. No checks and balances, just throwing democracy aside like it's a roadblock. Like, honestly, I'm not even connecting the dots here like it's a conspiracy. JD Vance is an explicit follower of Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel's anti-democratic, anti-American, pro-capitalism ideas.
So, I mean, I think that there are two different ideas here, right? So one is like, you know, there's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's written about some of these things, and so one is to basically accept that this entire thing is going to fall.
Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land also happen to be massively racist, while Peter Thiel himself grew up in a Nazi enclave in South Africa where people were still saluting to pictures of Hitler in public in the early 90s. But essentially, Peter Thiel's thing is technological progress. He talks about wanting to cure diseases, colonize new planets, invent new currencies, and whatever else. But in his mind, the only way to do that is to destroy the American way of life and replace it with a brave new world where he would be king. It starts to become a deceptively evil idea. Because I think we can all agree that Peter Thiel has a point. Let's be serious, okay? The idea that the information age has been a disappointment, it's pretty real. As a society, we don't invest in new systems that are for the broader benefit of humanity. We make platforms that get people addicted to slop content and brain drain our own society from the inside out. Our education and healthcare systems are clearly broken, literacy is down, our system is clearly not sustainable in a lot of ways. And so if someone comes along and says, hey, we need to actually focus more on improving things and making forward progress, I'm all ears. Of course, the only problem with Peter Thiel's vision of the world is that it's retarded. I mean, seriously. The idea of handing unrestricted, unlimited, king-level power over the government to a bunch of tech CEOs is ridiculous. It is beyond silly. We have seen over and over exactly what happens when capitalism doesn't get restricted or regulated fast enough to prevent disaster. After American corporations started sending manufacturing overseas for better profit margins, the country lost over 60,000 factories. Once thriving, growing, working-class cities like Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, even New Haven, JD Vance's college town, these places were slowly destroyed. New Haven itself lost 25% of its population over time. When its massive Winchester rifle factory, where many of the rifles that were used by various armies in World War I and II were built, closed in 2006, thousands of New Haven residents were left without jobs. And that is a very mild example of what happened all over America as factories were closed and labor was outsourced overseas. It has been horrible for America. I mean, there are cities that have lost 30, 50, even 70% of their population since the 1960s. I mean, we know this stuff, right? This is pretty basic. One of the most widely known downsides of capitalism is that it doesn't care what it breaks. It's the most robust economic system in the history of the world, and it has brought about unmatched progress, but it's so efficient that it will kill the same people who make its existence possible if you don't control it. But the idea that you would want to hand over massive unchecked amounts of power to the same class of people who operate on a profit incentive, the idea that we'd be better off with a CEO king, the idea that big tech needs to stand up and take over to make sure we keep moving forward, I think it's important to remember that progress doesn't always mean progress for everyone. So yeah, Peter Thiel, his dark Enlightenment friends, They have this plan to put not just tech, but everything into the hands of the same people for whom humanity itself has historically been an afterthought. I just don't hear that and think, great idea. But I think ultimately, it seems like Peter Thiel's thing was never really progress, liberty, or freedom. It has always been power and control. The tech and progress is just how he frames his method of accruing more control and influence, is his route to power. He is someone who sees the world through this lens of violence and power, domination. Tech is how he gets there. But the good news is that Peter Thiel is just a kind of sociopathic freak who screams all this stuff into the void, right? I mean, tech founders, tech bros, they always have crazy ideas. So who really cares if Peter Thiel goes a little too far in addressing his concerns? Well, the problem is that when I said that Peter Thiel doesn't go found new companies after PayPal, that wasn't quite right. There is one. Founded in 2004, he called it Palantir, named after the magic seeing stone crystal ball in The Lord of the Rings that can see into the past, that while very useful, is simultaneously susceptible to corruption by evil. And the mission is to rebuild the American surveillance system. You see, in the wake of 9/11, it was revealed that essentially the guys who had carried out the attack were known to various American intelligence agencies, but there were dots that hadn't been connected on the back end, and that ultimately stopped the attack from being prevented. That's the official story. At the same time, the Patriot Act is passed, and basically what happens after 9/11 is that the sanctity of privacy for American citizens continues to get more and more eroded in the name of security. And so Peter Thiel looks at what's going on and he says, hey, a lot of those anti-fraud tools that we built at PayPal, catching bad transactions, stopping scammers, we may be able to repurpose those for preventing more crimes by watching people. And so over the next couple of years, Peter Thiel builds this mysterious Palantir platform where no one knows what it is and no one knows what they do. The only thing that people know is that they have contracts with the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the IDF, every branch of the military, and local police departments all over the Americas and Europe. Over time, it becomes a little more clear. Palantir combines data collected by intelligence agencies and militaries to make spying and warfare more effective. It's a nervous system. It's a brain for the surveillance state. It makes Edward Snowden NSA look like a fucking angel. But the point of all this that I'm telling you right now is that the natural conclusion of Peter Thiel's lifelong obsession with freedom was never really about freedom. He was never a libertarian. It was about his freedom, his liberty, his money, his innovations. In the end, Peter Thiel has done nothing but make the very same problems that he spent his whole life arguing over worse. In seeking out his vision of freedom, he built machines that take it away for everyone else. And so ultimately, what we're seeing here is that Peter Thiel's vision of the world isn't a futuristic thought experiment. It's really the oldest idea on Earth, power concentrating upwards. But now, thanks to his relationship with JD Vance and the MAGA movement, he sells it as a way to save humanity. But in reality, it's ultimately nothing but an attempt to enrich himself by any means possible, no matter what it costs for the rest of us. But with all that being said, why would the Republican Party be the vehicle that Peter Thiel chooses to invest in? Why would JD Vance be his guy? Well, it's because he's the perfect hypocrite to make Peter Thiel's ideas look normal. In 2015, Peter Thiel gets really into Donald Trump. You have to remember what the reaction to Trump was early on. Intellectuals hated him. Academics hated him. He was seen as this big, nasty oaf who didn't respect the idea of a presidency, and a lot of the political gatekeepers at the time didn't really even get why he was so popular. He was even broadly hated by every other Republican. Back when Trump first came on the scene, a good portion of his own party was totally against him.
I have to say, seeing him go deeper and deeper to the gutter, it's not easy to tick me off. But you mess with my wife, you mess with my kids, that'll do it every time. Donald, you're a sniveling coward, and leave Heidi the hell alone.
I think one of the groups that hated him the most was big tech. In 2015, 2016, Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, they're all railing against Trump as being dangerous for America, being hateful.
Fearful voices calling for building walls and for slowing immigration, and instead of dividing people, we can help bring people together.
They were loudly, outwardly against the MAGA movement. And so Peter Thiel, in that moment, stood completely alone as one of the only billionaire entrepreneurs at the time who was happy to stand on stage and endorse Trump for president. He was the only tech bro who was ready to give Trump millions to get him elected. But why? What was he seeing that no one else did? Well, like we talked about, Peter Thiel's whole thing for 20 years has been taking away people's freedoms, so he gets more freedom to get richer and more powerful. He has made $500 billion off a CIA-backed surveillance company that builds databases so the government can spy on citizens more easily. So in the process of getting more power, well, he needs to go around the government. That's what he has said many times. We need to go around the government to get more influence and control because democracy will never allow that to happen. So he needs another Trojan horse that can infiltrate the system even further. And so MAGA is the vehicle that Peter Thiel chose to get him there. Peter Thiel is a gay guy who's married to another gay guy and has a bunch of kids with him. He is not a MAGA culture warrior. Okay, that's not what we're dealing with here. MAGA is the vehicle that he's going to use to get him his own personal goals. His support of JD Vance and Trump and all of that has absolutely nothing to do with him as a person. It has everything to do with his search for power and control. The problem, though, is that Peter Thiel's politics will never win in public. They will never be successful at face value in a democratic society, and he knows that. You can't just say, let's let billionaires run everything. That isn't the platform. No one's going to be down for that. So what you can do is you can make so much chaos that it becomes possible to do whatever you want in the background. And I think that's what we're looking at with a lot of recent political trends. Politics seems permanently focused on immigrants, trans panic, woke infighting, these opposing factions getting revenge on each other for culture war battles. All this stuff that's ultimately meaningless. It has no end, no beginning. It's vague and directionless. It's just a permanent culture war where we don't even remember why we're fighting anymore. At one point, JD Vance was even caught lying about Haitian immigrants in Ohio eating cats and killing children, but ended up openly admitting he made the story up completely while trying to play it off like he was doing it for some non-existent greater good. And it feels like we're so caught in this that we pay no attention to the slow destruction of the most fundamental aspects of American society. Labor is being automated, corporations are growing uncontrollably, the stock market is unsustainable, housing is out of control. Meanwhile, billionaires and corporations become more influential than ever before. The power of surveillance, corrosive influence of social media platforms, it feels like the fabric of our society, our way of life, is being torn to shreds while we sit around arguing about far less consequential issues. Not only does Peter Thiel have Big Brother from 1984 at his fingertips, but he bought the vice president of the country, and no one says anything. And I think that's because they've successfully created a widespread demand for the systems that Peter Thiel will use to control society. People have been manipulated to be so anxious and angry and afraid that they're cheering for the very things that will take away their freedom in the long run. So that's why MAGA works for Peter Thiel. That's why JD Vance is his guy. The movement is so heated and charged up that it becomes this huge theatrical cover while he and people like him work to dismantle the roadblocks that stop them from accruing unlimited power. I mean, Peter Thiel is a fucking CIA contractor. Not even a contractor. He is more powerful than the CIA. His company is a network that sits on top of everything that every Western intelligence agency knows it does. And speaking of the CIA, I made this shirt I'm wearing right now as a symbol of telling the truth no matter what, and rejecting the idea that it's anti-American to criticize our country. In a moment where there are literally foreign spy-backed people trying to accumulate power under the guise of being a conservative or whatever, it's our job more than ever to connect the dots and understand what's really going on. So yeah, you go to spiritworld.store, scan the QR code, or click the link in the description right now to cop your Award for Excellence in Journalism today, and maybe say a prayer that I don't get it in real life while you're at it.
I would like to introduce you to the Accountrepreneurs package. It is a